Hello, everybody. I'm Peter Yo. I'm Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at the United Nations Foundation. What an excellent panel that was. I am pleased to introduce our next conversation today, the future of humanitarian aid. So please join me in welcoming David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, Kyung-Hwa Kang, who's the Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator at OCHA, the UN's humanitarian agency, and my former boss, Madeleine Albright, the former U.S. Secretary of State and Chair of Albright Capital Management. And today's conversation will be moderated by Richard Wolff, Executive Editor of MSNBC.com. So please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have a fantastic panel and very little time. I'm going to plunge right in with, hopefully, a provocative question. Secretary Albright, is America doing enough with the scale of the humanitarian crisis we're seeing right now?
I don't think we are. I think we are a large and generous country with a real reputation always for welcoming people. I'm an immigrant. I came here when I was 11 years old. Not a terrible story in terms of escaping, but I was so grateful to come to America, and I know how much immigrants want to work and be a part of this country. And I think given the scale of the numbers and our capability, I do think we're not doing enough, and I'm very glad that Secretary Kerry has suggested that we take in 100,000 of the people that need to leave, the refugees and the migrants. I think we could do even more than that.
This humanitarian crisis has been going on for years, just specifically around Syria. So what do you think has been the barrier in the United States and in Europe to engaging with us until now?
Well, it's hard to figure out, I think, because I think partially it is a matter of not understanding that people are not able to live in their own country. But also, I have to say, and I hate to say this, but it is kind of what I call the fear factor. There are those people who say, well, they are Muslims and they are terrorists, and that is ridiculous. And there are vetting processes to try to make sure that those who might have any kind of a threat against us are excluded. And I think that we are a generous nation and one that is made up of diverse populations, and I hope very, very much that we take a more active role and thereby encourage other countries to do the same thing.
This is a feisty panel. So I'm just going to remind them not to wait for me to ask questions. But David, politics in Europe, you're also the President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, so you know what this is like on the ground. But having obviously been a major figure in British politics too, explain to us, if you can, these different currents of European politics. Germany says it's going to welcome lots of people, and then the borders get closed. Some countries are apparently kicking refugees as they run across the fields, and then others are saying we need to do more. What is going on in Europe in terms of the direction they're headed with regard to refugees and migrants?
Well, I think that two things are going on. On the one hand, you've got this record level of displacement. 20 million refugees last year, 40 million internally displaced. That means homeless within their own country. You've got incredibly complex old wars in Somalia and Congo, and then you have relatively new wars in Syria and Iraq. And the first thing that people fear in the midst of that complexity is, my goodness, I don't think we can make a difference. And so I think the first factor that one has to understand is that there's a crisis of credibility in terms of tackling either the symptoms or the causes. In terms of the symptoms, people think, well, what's the point of helping 1,000 people when there are 4 million refugees, or even 100,000? The second thing that's going on is, frankly, in Europe, they've had their mind on the Euro crisis and on the conflict with Ukraine, or over Ukraine. And Europe has just not been focused on this, despite the efforts of the Italian Prime Minister here last year, despite the Pope in June 2014 talking about the globalization of indifference. I mean, that's an extraordinary charge to make against all of us. And I think what you're seeing is that crisis of credibility playing out into inertia in global political systems, and that's why the poor people of Syria, I've just come back from Lesbos in Greece, where half of the Syrian and Afghan refugees are arriving into Europe. Those poor people who are risking everything to get across the Aegean, never mind across Turkey, are doing so because they've lost hope that there's any political or humanitarian help coming to them in Syria itself.
And it's pretty desperate for the aid workers too. There are really just not enough of them in a place like Lesbos.
Yeah, I mean, look, Europe is not set up to be, it's a tourist haven, Lesbos. It's not, I mean, I've got staff in Niger, I've got staff in Mali, I've got staff in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and I've had to send some staff to Lesbos in Greece. And that shows you the stretch in the system. But I want to make if there's one thing that people take away from this session, it would be the following. We don't just need more aid, we need better aid. And there's a really important reason that the nature of the conflicts that are producing these record refugee flows, the circumstances in which people are finding themselves are different than before. And let me just give you one example. My organization was founded by Albert Einstein. The iconic image of a refugee is actually someone in a refugee camp. But today, 80% of refugees are in urban areas. So the tools that have been developed for providing schools and healthcare in traditional refugee settings don't fit for the majority of refugees today. And I really hope people take away with them the idea that we have to change the humanitarian aid system as well as have more of it.
Kinkwa,
Yes.
you were just in Democratic Republic of Congo. Obviously, lots of refugees who have been living in really squalid conditions for many, many years now. Lots of attention to a new wave of refugees, but do we risk losing sight of people who have been stuck in really an awful situation for a very long time?
Yes, which is why I decided to go to the DRC, because when I started this job about 3 years ago, DRC was one of our biggest crises, where many of the humanitarian organizations have and continue to have our big operations, but it's completely dropped off the global media attention. But the situation there hasn't improved one bit. And I visited an IDP site near Goma, and I'm told that it's one of the best of the 57 sites in the province, but it was devastating to see people living in these conditions. But what we do take away every time we have to work in these very difficult circumstances is the resilience of the people. I mean, half the population wasn't getting any food assistance because agencies had run out of money. There was no health services to speak of. But the people themselves were doing whatever they can to feed their families in very squalid conditions. And so, as David says, I think part of the rethinking of the humanitarian assistance to make it more effective, to make every dollar run further, is to build upon that resilience and nurture those of us within the humanitarian establishment away from this perpetuation of the dependency on humanitarian aid.
I think what's interesting is we kind of lump everybody together, and just from listening here is they're very different conditions. So what's happening in the DRC and squalid is very different from a refugee camp, the Syrian one in Jordan that I visited. Very clean, there are places to live, etc. The problem is that there is nothing to do. And one of the real issues are the kids that have nothing to do and are really there. Ultimately, there'll be a petri dish for those that are going to learn to hate. And so we have a different issue there, and then a different issue for those that have actually migrated to some other place and live in urban areas. And so I think we should try to be more I think clearer in terms of the differences among refugees, migrants, and even within that, and that this is something, it goes to your point, David, of having a different aid aspects to it.
The larger picture is 100 million people around the world, whether refugees or IDPs, and that's about 60 million. But there are 40 million more people, not necessarily displaced, but still needing life-saving assistance within their own communities. And I think we need to keep the focus on that totality of 100 million people in really life-saving need.
And it's going to be impossible to get to the Sustainable Development Goals that everyone's feeling very cheerful about without dealing with the refugees, because it cuts across so many of these global goals. David, do you see given the politics of where we're at right now, obviously there are anti-immigrant parties and politicians in lots of different countries, being realistic, you know, we say we want better aid, but the chance of more aid for the scale of the problem here, is that realistic?
I think it is, because the evidence of the last 15 years is that countries like China and India may be suffering large inequality, but hundreds of millions of people have come out of poverty, not through aid, but through economic growth.
Right.
And in stable settings, economic growth, preferably more inclusive economic growth, more equitable economic growth, is the way forward. And so I don't think it's unrealistic to say there has to be a shift of the aid focus from stable developing states to conflict states. And let me just give you this. 43% of the world's extreme poor live in conflict states. And it's going to be 65% by 2030. And my worry is less on the money side, it's more that we're stuck in a system of short-term reactivity that isn't keeping up with the scale or the nature of the problem. And the grave danger is that by 2030, I mean, this is the theme of this conference, the great danger is that there's a new inequality between people in stable states who are doing better, in part thanks to the Sustainable Development Goals, and people in conflict settings, 30 to 35 countries that are consumed by civil war and violence. The great danger is that they are left further behind. And the fact that in the 169 targets, there is minimal mention of civilians in conflict situations tells you that there's a huge implementation job to be done on these Sustainable Development Goals to make sure that the applause, which you rightly point to, is turned into real action.
Right, because it's a tremendous drag. Internally displaced people, the influx of foreign aid, it's a tremendous distortion for developing countries as well when these crises happen.
Well, I think the, you know, with the commitment of the SDGs is, yes, there's very little on the humanitarian needs and challenges in conflict situations, but there is a commitment to leave no one behind and to end extreme hunger and poverty, extreme poverty, 43% which are in conflict situations, and 60% more likely in 2030. So if we don't bring focused investment, both humanitarian and development assistance, into these fragile countries who are suffering from violence and conflict, we're not going to be able to attain that very ambitious goal. So all of the goals, without a focus on the most marginalized, vulnerable, and many of them in fragile countries, the goals will not be attained.
Secretary Albright, I can't help thinking of your Kosovo question that you asked of Colin Powell. In these situations, whether it's Syria or any number of other what look like overwhelming challenges, I think you said something like, I'm going to garble it, what's the point of having this superb military if you're not prepared to use it? There have been chances for intervention. We seem to be unclear about when to use intervention, when we have a responsibility to use intervention, whether it's humanitarian corridors or no-fly zones. Is there an opportunity, is there a need for the world's powers to actually intervene, even if there's not a consensus in the United Nations?
Well, I believe in dealing with a humanitarian issue that most people, refugees, migrants, want to live in the country where they were born. I think that the family, language, etc. So one of the ways to deal with this is to try to solve what is going on in Syria. That cannot be done unless there is an international effort to do it. It is something that the leaders are dealing with as we speak, and the question is how to get the region to mobilize and work together. And I do think that interesting part is we used force in Kosovo. The United Nations deemed it illegal. We saved many people's lives because we knew that it was going to be vetoed by the Russians. So I think we did use NATO. You can get around in a different way with multilateral action. I think we have to be creative and we have to figure out how to solve the issue in Syria. It's going to take a while, but there's no other way to deal with these humanitarian crises if you don't also deal with what's going on the ground. And then the neighboring countries, if I might. Jordan, yesterday I saw King Abdullah of Jordan. This is a country that is a small country. It has refugee camps of Syrians, Iraqis, and Palestinians. And the numbers are the following. It's as though, the ratio, it's as though the United States had 60 million refugees. Right. We are a huge country. They are a small country. They are a frontline state. And so it isn't just the refugees. It is what it does to disequilibrate the things that are going on in the region.
One last question, quick one for everyone. It seems that public opinion, at least, has got galvanized by the power of a single image. in the case of the child in Syria. The power of images. I believe you were actually as a child in a war,
Movie,
a refugee child war movie. Power of an image to move people, and what people can do, perhaps with technology, as individuals, to support and promote what needs to be done at an international level. David, do you want to kick that one off?
Small question.
In 60 seconds or less.
Look, I think that that phrase, the globalization of indifference, I think is actually wrong. I think that in many, many ways, the global population is more conscious of the abuse of rights around the world than it's ever been. And so it's a question of agency, of activity. And I would say that I'd point you in 3 directions, and I'd actually start local. In 22 cities around the United States, the IRC is resettling refugees into this country, and we need volunteers, we need mentors, we need supporters. Secondly, one person alone may feel isolated, but in a company or in a public sector organization where there are thousands of employees, I think that you can mobilize collective activity in ways that has been impossible before. You don't need a big traditional hierarchy to get a lot of people to engage. And the third thing, frankly, is that NGOs who are increasingly in the front line in the face of the retreat of government need funding.
Right.
Because it's not just the UN appeal that is 41% funded this year for Syria. It's not just the UN that's torn between the headlines and the long-term conflicts. It's also the NGOs. And at a time when NGOs are operating in Boko Haram areas, in ISIS areas, in Jabhat al-Nusra areas, but government authorities can't, and there are millions of civilians who depend on it, then I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say everyone should go onto the IRC website, rescue.org, and they should figure out how they're going to make a contribution, because that's really the front line of humanitarian effort today.
Last words, the only refugee among us.
Well, I think that people have to put themselves into the position of those who are being turned away. And I think we're all the same, and seeing the child was a huge thing, but put yourself in the position of having left everything and trying to get into a country where you can be free and you're treated like an animal. Put yourself in that position. That's the only way to really understand it.
Please join me. Thank you for the panel.
Brilliant. As always.